Benvenuti a questa intervista di Mari di Libri di Brian Selznick, autore di La straordinaria invenzione di Hugo Cabret e La Querza. Io sono Michela.
Io Alice.
E stasera lo intervisteremo.
La prima domanda che le volevamo porre è, nel suo libro troviamo una citazione di Maurice Sendak in cui dice che le poesie non hanno bisogno di un'illustrazione. Questo ha reso più difficile il lavoro che ha fatto su queste poesie, su questo libro, oppure no?
That's a very good question, and the answer is it made it much more complicated. When I met Maurice Sendak, I had already been a very big fan of his work and was very nervous to meet him because he meant so much to me. And but we became friends, and he liked my work and gave me good advice. And the invention of Hugo Cabret really happened because of conversations that I had with Maurice Sendak. And it was from Maurice that I learned about these 12 secret poems that the American poet Walt Whitman wrote about a love affair he had with another man. And Maurice said that he was thinking about illustrating the book himself, or a book with those poems in it himself. But that's when he said to me that he believes that poetry shouldn't be illustrated because good illustrations in a book make the words mean something new when you have the words and the pictures together. So you don't want to just draw exactly what the words say. In a good illustrated book, the words and the pictures should work together to create something that is completely new, that is beyond the words and beyond the pictures. And I think what Maurice meant when he said that poetry should not be illustrated is that poetry is language that is itself meant to make the reader see things in their mind. And it's also very personal and very direct from the writer of the poetry, from the poet, to the reader. And Maurice believed that an illustration or a drawing would get in the way of that relationship between the poem and the reader. So he felt that poetry should be left on its own. But he was thinking about it, right? Like he was thinking, and he has illustrated some poetry. And then there are poets like William Blake who wrote poetry and illustrated their own poems. So, I guess you could say for every rule there are exceptions. And so after Maurice died, and I was thinking about these poems, and I was thinking about my love of Maurice and wanting to make something that was in honor of him, I was thinking, like, how could I make this book and draw pictures, right? Without making Maurice's memory angry. I don't want Maurice's ghost to be upset with me. And so I thought about all the pictures that I have drawn in books like The Invention of Hugo Cabret and Wonderstruck and The Marvels, where there's these long sequences of pictures that are narratives that help tell the story separate from the words. And so I realized that there might be a way to use pictures without illustrating the poems themselves directly. So that's what gave me the idea to create about, I don't know how many pictures it is, like maybe like 100 pictures that you look with no poetry. You just open the book and there's a little introduction, and then it's just pictures, one after the other, that evoke feelings from the poems and evoke some of the images from the poems, but don't actually illustrate the poems themselves. And then you turn the page and suddenly the 12 poems begin and then they all exist in the book without any pictures. And a lot of people are intimidated about reading poetry. They think it's difficult, or sometimes they feel like they can't understand it. But by looking at all the pictures in the book, and you see images of trees and men and flames and floods and snow and all of these sort of emotional images, I hoped that when you got to the poems and you read poems about trees and passion and men and cities and things like that, you wouldn't be looking at the pictures at the exact same moment, but you'd remember the things you saw, and maybe it would help you understand the poems more. So it was sort of a new way to think about using images in a book for me. And I was very happy with how it came out as a structure for the book. And I hope that Maurice would agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
La prossima domanda può essere una domanda difficile per molti autori. E quali sentimenti e quali emozioni prova quando scrive e quando disegna? Dove si trovano le differenze? E se preferisce un'attività all'altra?
Sorry.
That is a very challenging question. And I think in pictures. I don't think in words, usually. I think in pictures. But I never draw anything first. I always write down in words what I think I'm going to draw, if I'm going to draw something. So I will draw, first we see the moon. Then we see the moon over Paris. Then we see a train station in Paris. Then we see a boy going into the train station in Paris. And I can see in my mind what I want all of those drawings to be, but I'm describing them first. So for me, there's not a real difference between the imagination of the pictures and the writing of the invention of the stories. But I was trained as an artist, right? I went to art school. I've always thought of myself as an artist. So in a way, when I start drawing, it feels a little bit more natural. Like I feel like I know it's hard. Like I still have a difficult time drawing, but I've learned how to draw. No one ever really taught me how to write. So, I mean, I wrote in school and I had good teachers who helped me and I have, good editors who helped me with my writing. But I don't feel like I was trained to write. So sometimes when I actually have to come up with the specific words in a story or in a sentence, it feels difficult. It feels difficult to choose the exact words. Like if I'm drawing someone running down the street, like I can see it in my head. I can see the angle and I can see where I want the buildings and I can see the person with their legs and what their arms are like. But if I have to write that same scene, do I write the boy ran down the street? Do I write the street was dark and it was windy and the boy turned the corner and ran quickly? Or there's what do you do? There's so many words, in whatever language you speak, there are so many words. And so I do feel sometimes when I'm trying to write the language that is going to be in the story, it sometimes feels a little bit more challenging. But I will say also, I have a really hard time drawing. And so I can, like I just described, I can see things in my head, but that doesn't mean I can draw them well from my head. So I can draw quickly and it looks okay. You can sort of tell it's someone running. But then I usually need to do a lot of research and I need to go to the city where the book takes place. I need to photograph people posing, kids posing in the positions that I've imagined the kids in. And so I do a lot of research and sketches to get the drawings to look the way I want them. And then a lot of it, in both cases, is, I get frustrated and I feel like I'm never going to make it as good as I want it to be. But, I keep going back and, we can talk about that because I'm sure you experience very similar things when you're working as well. But for me, when it comes together, when I find the right words and I find the right drawing and they work well together, it feels like a very magical and satisfying moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Abbiamo notato che le sue illustrazioni spesso sono in bianco e nero. È una scelta stilistica o è un caso? E se sì, perché?
Yeah, I've always really loved black and white images. I find that they have a certain mystery to them because even though, perhaps you could draw realistically in black and white, but most people don't see the world in black and white. So you always have to imagine something into a black and white drawing, right? It's like if you look at an old black and white photograph, the world wasn't black and white, right? Like the world was just as colorful as it is now. It was just that the technology only allowed people to take photographs that were black and white. And so it feels old-fashioned to us because that's what the images look like. But that's not what the world looked like. So we can look at those images and we can imagine, like, you know, what color was that car? What color was that dress? What color was the hat? And that kind of need to work with the viewer so that when I'm drawing a black and white picture, I'm not telling you everything, right? Like I'm leaving space for you to decide and for you to imagine what a part of the picture is like. And I do that in a lot of different ways too, because sometimes very often I like to draw like people just like disappearing behind a wall, or you only see like part of a hand. And that's something that I first noticed in the work of Edward Gorey, who did really wonderful books that some people think are for children, but they're very weird and dark and mostly for adults. But he would often just draw like a glimpse of someone disappearing behind a curtain or around a corner. And what that does is it allows you to imagine what that person looks like and what that person is doing and why they're turning the corner. So that's really what interests me, is how I can engage you as the reader to imagine part of what I'm creating, so that you and I are actually collaborating with each other. So that when you're looking at the pictures, it's not just like, oh, that's everything I need to know. It's enough to give you information that's important, but it's really a collaboration so that you finish what happens in the picture. And even when I'm doing my long sequences of drawings, you know, a lot of things happen between this picture and then the next picture. Even if it's someone running down the hall and then further away, like you have to imagine the person between those two images, or then the next image and then the next image. So that kind of collaboration really interests me. But, you know, I do color pictures sometimes too, and I think I like working in color. But I think that's why I mostly like working in black and white.
Thank you.
Ora, riguardo al suo libro di Hugo Cabret, il personaggio stesso di Hugo Cabret, per crearlo, ha preso ispirazione da qualcuno che conosceva già? Ha preso ispirazione da lei stesso? Si rivede nella passione che ha Hugo per gli orologi? Rivede la sua passione che ha per il disegno?
So Hugo began when I learned about Georges Méliès, the French filmmaker who made A Trip to the Moon. And I learned that he had a collection of automatons in real life that at the end of his life were given to a museum, and they never put them on display. They put them in an attic and they got rained on. And I heard that they were all thrown away. This may not entirely be true, I found out later, but it was a really interesting story. And I imagined this pile of broken automatons, and then I just saw a boy finding those machines and rescuing one of them. And I became very curious about who that boy was and why he would think that he could fix one of these broken machines and have an interest in this machine. So the whole story of the invention of Hugo Cabret is me just trying to answer those questions. Who is this kid? Why does he think he can fix this machine? And why does he want to fix this machine? And so it took, I tend to work in a somewhat strange backwards way, because first I will think of things that happen in a story and a place. Then I will think of the person or the people who would fit into that to make that story happen. And then the last thing I think of is the reason the person is doing the thing to make the plot happen. I don't recommend working like this. It doesn't make any sense, but it's just how my books keep happening. And so I got excited about writing a story about Paris and Georges Méliès and the automatons and this kid. And then I had to figure out, like I said, who the kid was and come up with the character of Georges Méliès and his granddaughter, and who became Isabelle. And he had a real granddaughter who just died within the last few years. And I ended up meeting her. And her real name was Madeline. And she was really amazing. But even though there were real parts of the story, like George Méliès really had a granddaughter, and he was a real person, I was writing a work of fiction. So I wanted to use as much from real life as I could, but then I also wanted to make up this story about this kid. And so I did use elements from my own life and gave them to Hugo. And most of the kids who I write about in my books are regular kids who find themselves in some kind of extraordinary situation and then do things that, you might think would be scary or difficult, but it's something that anybody might, do if they were in a similar extreme, strange circumstance. And Hugo, I think, is the only kid I've written about who has a special talent. None of the other kids have a special talent. Hugo's special talent is he can fix machines. And I remember when I was a kid, the pleasure of being able to do things with my hands and build things and draw. But I also remember the frustration of not being able to make certain things, or like having a model or certain things, and feeling like my hands can't do what I want them to do. And so when I was writing about Hugo, I remember describing the way he works with machines and fits things together, and what he learned from his dad, and what he can do with it, the way he listens to the machines. Which actually, that detail I learned from a friend of mine who's a really incredible person who can fix anything. Like, he really can. Like, I found someone like Hugo grown up who really can fix any machine. And so I asked him what he was like as a kid, and that was something he told me, that he would listen to machines and he could hear if they sounded well or not. Like he could, like a doctor, like he could diagnose if they sounded unwell. And but all of those elements, some from my friends, some from me, and my hands went into the character of Hugo. And one of the last things that I came up with in the story, because I wrote the whole plot and started even doing the drawings, where I had Hugo and Isabel and the key. I figured out the key around Isabel's neck and the machine. And I finally got to the part where they put the key into the automaton, and it was time for the automaton to do something. And at first I thought the automaton was going to write a poem. And I actually wrote the poem that the automaton was going to write. And it was a poem about Prometheus. You guys know the Greek god Prometheus, he creates humanity. And he then, I think out of clay, and then he steals fire from the gods to give to his creation to keep them alive, to help them stay alive and survive. And so I wrote a poem about Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to create cinema. And so he steals the fire, and then it's the light from the fire that creates cinema. But then I thought that I wanted the automaton to have a connection to Hugo somehow, beyond just the words of a poem. And so I thought, the automaton should draw. Not write, he should draw. And then I had to figure out what the automaton was going to draw. And so I eventually decided that the automaton would draw the rocket going into the eye of the man on the moon. But then I had to figure out why. Like why was that important? Why was that important to I did not have the part of the plot that said why that was important. And so I thought about it for a really long time. And like the last thing I thought of, what I'll say is this. My dad died right before I started working on Hugo. And so I was really sad about the fact that my dad died. And so I didn't want Hugo's dad to die, right? Like, I wanted his dad to be alive because I didn't want to write about it. So I was like, so I was racking my brain. I was like, why is Hugo connected to the machine? Why is he connected to this drawing? And I remember the minute, and it took me months, like this went on for months of me trying to find a reason for Hugo to have a connection with the drawing. And finally, I remember sitting at my desk and like not knowing why. And then suddenly I was like, it's because Hugo's dad died, like mine. I think I probably started crying, and then I was like, oh my gosh, like that's what it is. And as soon as I let myself realize that, I was able to finish the entire story. Like suddenly the whole story made sense. So it wasn't until the very end of the process that I realized that Hugo's dad had died. So that obviously was a very personal part of the story for me. And so in a way, allowing Hugo to have that moment and that grief was helpful to me too, for me to think about my dad and to grieve and to give that to Hugo as well.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, you're welcome.
L'ultima domanda è se si è riscoperto in alcune delle poesie di Whitman.
That is a very good question, as have all of your questions been amazing questions. It's been so nice to talk to both of you and to answer your questions. They're thoughtful, they're very, very intelligent, very insightful about the books and the work. So thank you for asking these amazing questions. And I will say that the La Quercia is actually the second book that I've made about Walt Whitman. Many years ago, I made a children's book meant for younger kids about Walt Whitman that really focused on his entire life, from his birth to his death, in about 48 pages. And it was very difficult to write. I didn't write it. It was difficult to illustrate. It was written by a friend of mine named Barbara Curley. And it was very difficult to make the book because his work and his life aren't really for young children. Like his work and his life are really for older students like yourselves and grown-ups. And so it was very difficult to try to figure out how young children could connect with Walt Whitman. And this was back in the early 2000s. The Iraq War had just begun, and there were stories on the radio about soldiers coming back from Iraq with very serious injuries and trying to recuperate. And of course, Walt Whitman was alive during the Civil War, and he worked as a nurse trying to help the soldiers who had been injured in the Civil War. And he would write letters for them because a lot of them didn't know how to read and write. And he then turned the pain of that experience in the war into poetry and books and all sorts of writing. And so I thought that's something kids, like young kids, will understand. Like the idea of taking something painful and turning it into art. Like that's something everybody could understand. And so when I was so many years went by, and then Maurice Sendak told me about these poems. I actually, before I made La Quercia, I actually made a puppet show for grown-ups about these same poems. If you go online, I have a website and I can give you all the information. And I have a recording of the puppet show that I made with these same 12 poems. And it was not a puppet, because a lot of people think puppets are for little kids, but it was a puppet show really for grown-ups. But it wasn't. It was also a super weird puppet show, very small little objects and things happening. Sort of hard to describe, but you can
We'll
watch it. You'll watch it.
We will.
And so it was going back and looking again at those poems for the puppet show. And a friend of mine who's a musician set the poems to music and sang them while playing the cello as I was performing the puppet show. And then it was a few years after that I turned it into the book. And so these poems, no one really knows the story behind these poems, except that he never published them the way that he wrote them. He took them apart, and he wrote 12, and we know what order they were supposed to be in because of something that happened later, but he cut them up, he rearranged them, and hid them in another book he made called Leaves of Grass. So no one knew about the poems in La Quercia for 100 years, till someone did some, detective work and pieced them back together and found the original notebook and saw what the original order was. But it seems like it's a set of poems about a love affair that he had with another man, or the idea of being in love with other men. And what happens when you meet someone, the excitement of meeting someone new, the feeling of being in a relationship, and then the sadness of what happens when that relationship ends. And then what happens after it ends and you have to start again, right? How do you go on with your life? And so I think anybody, really almost everybody, could find something for themselves in the poems, whether you're straight or gay or bisexual or asexual, whether it's a relationship with a friend or a lover or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever it is. I think there's things to connect with in these poems because they're so personal and they're so human. And so it definitely, like, it made me think a lot about my husband. I've been married to my husband for 24, well, we've been together for 24 years. We couldn't get married for most of the beginning of our relationship. Then when it became legal, we got married. And so it made me think a lot about my relationship with him and what that was like in other relationships we had both had before we met each other. So I think there was a lot of finding myself again in these poems, as I think anybody can find themselves in these poems. Oh my gosh, it's been so nice to talk to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's been really fun.
Ricordatevi di iscrivervi al canale e di lasciare mi piace sotto questo video.